I make these videos to help myself remember things that I'm interested in, and today I'm going to talk about the enzyme SCD1 and its importance in adiposity and metabolism. SCD1, or steryl-CoA desaturase 1, is the rate-limiting enzyme for the synthesis of oleic acid in the body. Oleic acid is the most common fatty acid in the body. When this enzyme is active, it is largely responsible for diverting fat to storage rather than for beta oxidation or usage. Basically, SCD1 takes fat that you eat and turns it into fat that you store. So let's take a look at this study in humans, where we can see a very clear correlation between SCD1 activity and BMI in humans. The higher the SCD1 activity, the higher the BMI. As SCD1 increases, so does fat mass. Obese animals and humans make a lot of SCD1, and increasing SCD1 makes animals fatter. Animals that don't have a lot of SCD1 don't accumulate a lot of fat. In this study, they showed the correlation between SCD1 and BMI. In this next study, they demonstrate that SCD1 overexpression is enough on its own to induce fat storage. So the top row of this picture is the control, and the bottom row are cardiac cells made to overexpress SCD1. We can see here that these cardiac cells accumulate fat when they are exposed to free fatty acids, and SCD1 is overexpressed. We can also see in each column that this effect appears to be dose dependent, but look at the control versus the experimental. With the same dose, look at the boxes C and F, where even though they are both given the same dose of fatty acids, the SCD1 group stores way more fat. Or compare boxes C and E, where the experimental box E, is exposed to less fat, but stores more fat than that of box C. This is congruent with other studies that show that animals who have higher SCD1 get fatter while eating less, which is again demonstrated in this mouse study where several things are measured. The yellow are mice that lack SCD1, and pink is the control. In the first graph, you can see the SCD1 deficient mice eat more food than control. And in the second graph, you can see that despite their increased food intake, they weigh the same as the control mice. So they eat more and they don't gain weight. A lot of focus has been given to leptin for possible implications in obesity and weight loss. Leptin is considered fat burning and is a signal for satiety. You might know it as the opposite of ghrelin, which increases appetite and food intake. A while ago, they thought that if they just gave obese people leptin, it would decrease their weight. This didn't really pan out because the initial thought was that people gained weight because they didn't have enough leptin. While this may be true for a very small group of people, generally obese humans secrete more leptin than normal weight people and are not leptin deficient, but leptin resistant because of their higher leptin secretion. And this would be analogous to type 2 diabetics who become insulin resistant and require more and more insulin over time because their bodies no longer respond to it in the same way it used to before becoming insulin resistant. So now let's look at these graphs again. The green are mice with no SCD and no leptin. So you can see how the lack of leptin is causing an increase in appetite and increase in food intake. In fact, they're eating more than twice as much food as the pink control group. And look at their BMI, only a little bit higher. So these mice with inactive SCD1 are eating way more food, but not gaining much weight. Now, the blue bar represents mice with a functional SCD1 gene and no leptin. We can see they are eating more than control, about the same as the yellow SCD1 deficient mice, and although they are eating less than the green, which are the leptin and SCD1 deficient mice, they weigh much more. Again, these mice are eating less and gaining more weight. Now, compare the SCD1 deficient yellow group with the blue group. Remember, the blue group has a functional SCD1 gene but lacks leptin. They're eating about the same, but by about 14 weeks, the blue group weighs more than twice as much as the yellow group in the control. Once again, they eat less, they get fatter. Something to note is that leptin down-regulates SCD1. So this blue group not only lacks leptin, which makes them hungrier to start with, but they're also missing out on the SCD1 inhibiting properties of leptin. So higher leptin means lower SCD1. I said earlier that obese people have higher leptin, so that should be down-regulating SCD1, right? Probably not. These people have higher leptin because they are leptin resistant. They don't actually get the benefits of leptin, they just need more to do the same thing. So the higher leptin in the obese is not down-regulating SCD1, and we know this because SCD1 is higher in obese people despite leptin also being higher. This graph shows a baseline amount of SCD1 expression, which is the white bar, and the effects of insulin and leptin on the expression of SCD1. Insulin, the light gray bar, upregulates SCD1, and you can see leptin, the black bar, downregulates SCD1, and together they seem to keep it at kind of a baseline balance. So again, if we look at these graphs, it's apparent that the SCD1 deficient mice seem to have very fast metabolisms, and this is confirmed in more data from the same study as well as this other study, both showing increased metabolism in SCD1 deficient mice. But why do SCD1 deficient mice have higher metabolisms? So there is an emerging hypothesis of obesity that some are calling the ROS theory of obesity. ROS stands for reactive oxygen species. Brad Marshall, author of the Fire in a Bottle blog, thinks the reason the SCD1 deficient mice have such high metabolisms can be explained by the ROS theory of obesity, which I will try to explain in a nutshell without getting into too much detail here. So, lowering SCD1 levels means that saturated fat is not getting converted to unsaturated oleic acid. So the body shifts to a higher percent composition of saturated fats. Saturated fats produce more ROS when burned, which leads to a greater production of something called NRF2, which leads to an upregulation of UCP1, which is uncoupling protein 1, which is responsible for brown fat thermogenesis, and higher UCP1 means that you are burning more fat for heat rather than just storage. So the mice are just burning off all the extra calories. How do we know that a shift in body fat composition towards more saturated fat leads to increased thermogenesis? Let's look at this study. It shows that if you give SCD1 deficient mice oleic acid, they get fatter. The black bars are SCD1 deficient mice. You can see in the last two sets that when the mice are fed monounsaturated oleic acid, that they get fatter, but not if they are fed unsaturated stearic acid. These mice are getting fat on one kind of fat, but not another kind of fat. And recall that SCD1 turns saturated fat into monounsaturated oleic acid to be stored. So less oleic acid, less fat storage, but also a shift towards a more saturated fat composition leads to a greater generation of ROS and an increase in thermogenesis, which appears to be true here as the mice fed the saturated stearic acid increased expression of thermogenic uncoupling proteins versus mice fed monounsaturated fat. So what actually is stearic acid and what is oleic acid? Well, we know they're fats, but where can we find them? Well, oleic acid is generally considered a heart-healthy monounsaturated fat, usually found in olive oil, while stearic acid is a bad saturated fat found in the fat of ruminant animals, especially around the kidneys, like in the case of suet, but it is also found in cocoa butter. So how can we apply this to diet? There are things that upregulate and downregulate SCD1. Things that increase SCD1 include insulin, sugar, and fructose, and some things known to decrease SCD1 are stearic acid, puer tea, naringin, which is like an orange extract, theobromine, which is kind of like caffeine. It's in chocolate, coffee, glucagon, leptin, sterculic acid, and 5 grams a day of fish oil, according to one study, berberine, astaxanthin, taurine, and metformin. So, to recap, SCD1 makes you get fat even if you eat less. Lowering SCD1 alters your fat composition towards more saturated. Higher amount of saturated fat leads to more fat burning, less fat storing. And if you want to know more about this, you should definitely check out Brad Marshall's blog at fireinaBottle.com.